Mr. Jones.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So there's been some questions about why we're even talking about this, and the fact of the matter is we're in kind of an odd situation. So state law has a provision that talks about what to do if there's a vacancy during someone's term, either a council member or a mayor during the middle of their term. It does not anywhere address what happens if that midterm vacancy happens to happen after there's an election. And I've talked with the Lieutenant Governor's office and confirmed that there isn't any other statutory process in place at this time other than the one that we've exchanged some emails and some memos about already. And so that provision is found in Utah Code 20A-1-510, and as laid out in the memos and emails that we've discussed, it just says that anytime there is a midterm vacancy, that the council has the ability to fill that vacancy, and that they do so by holding a public meeting, which they give at least 14 days notice of. And that notice has to include the date and time of the meeting, where persons who are interested in being appointed to the office can turn in their information and the deadline for doing so. And then at that meeting, those candidates, those who submit their names, have to be interviewed in open meeting. That's actually a relatively recent change. The legislature added that provision back in 2012 when Orem City interviewed their mayoral candidates in closed session, and the legislature didn't like that, so they amended that to require that the interviews happen in open meeting. And then there's a vote, and it contemplates there being 2 votes. Cliff and I talked yesterday. If the first vote is unanimous, that's probably not necessary, but it contemplates that if you have multiple candidates, you would have the first vote to narrow it down to 2, the 2 top vote getters, and then have a second vote amongst those 2. In our form of government, the council mayor form of government, it also specifically provides that if there's any time period between the office of mayor becoming vacant and the appointment by the council of an interim mayor, that the council chair shall be the acting mayor. And it specifically authorizes the council chair to act both as the mayor and as a member of the council during that time period. There's also a city provision that's relevant, because the city provision specifically requires that the council act within 30 days of the vacancy occurring. The state statute is much more ambiguous. It says that if you don't act within 30 days, then you must act, but doesn't clearly define when that should be.
And it stipulates that you pick from the people who applied in that 30 days.
Right, right. And that also was a change because of a recent situation where there used to be a provision in that ordinance, in that statute, that said that if you were a council member who was putting your name in to be appointed to be the mayor, that you couldn't participate in the voting. And apparently they had a city where, I don't know how many members of the council there were in that city, but all but one of them put their name in. So only one of them could vote, and he got to pick. So they took out the provision that said that if your name is in the hat, that you can't vote. And they also changed it to say you have to pick from the people who put their name in, because they had another situation where the statute used to say you shall vote. And there was a city where they voted, but the vote was deadlocked, and so they never filled the office. And so they changed it to say you shall fill the office instead of you shall merely vote. But even with all of those changes, to me, they have not yet clarified whether that 30 days is actually a hard deadline or not. So the deadline, in my mind, actually comes from city code rather than state code. And if we want to get hyper technical about it, that's even a little bit interesting, because the city code defines vacancy slightly differently than state code does. The state code talks about there being any other reason, which the Lieutenant Governor's office conferred with and have confirmed that their interpretation of that would include taking another office. But the city code only talks about resigning or dying or moving out of the city. So there's potentially some ambiguities in the way the two laws work together and in what the state law means in the first place as far as the time frame. But the general accepted principles are that the council has the authority to fill that vacancy, and that they do so by soliciting names and then holding that public meeting with at least 14 days notice. And as we've indicated in some of the materials, it is a little bit odd, or unique, that's probably a better word. It's a little bit unique to do this after an election when you've already had an expression by the voters of who the mayor-elect is. But there's not a state statute that addresses that situation.
And there could be a myriad of reasons why a council would want to appoint someone different, but at the same time, there may be a reason, there may be an incoming mayor who might say, I need a couple of months to get ready. Those are the kinds of things that also could factor into your decision making.
Having gone through this before, I feel strongly that the newly elected mayor needs a period of time before they take office to become acclimatized to the position and what they're doing. So I like the 30-day with the council chair being the interim mayor and then filling it within sometime after the 30 days. 30 days is, I think 30 days, I had 2 months, which were invaluable. I was here every day except weekends. So I think it would be a perfect scenario to have the council chairs take that position and then put the new person in, the newly elected person in for the last period of time after the 30 days.
Mr. Chair, I should probably clarify, I left this out of my discussion, that I should, just for the public and for the record of this meeting, that the purpose of the meeting today is not to take any action on appointing an interim mayor, because one, the election still is coming. We won't know until after the election if that even needs to happen, that something has even has happened. And I think statutorily, the council is required, if the council does act to appoint, they're required to have that meeting and to interview everyone that's submitted their name and make a decision then. But there has been some discussion about discussing the process, understanding what the process was, and maybe signaling what, if the council has some intent of what they think that might be the best procedure to follow, or the way that it might shake out without making a final decision.
Mayor Curtis, do you have any thoughts on this or any update?
I do. First of all, let me acknowledge that we don't know what's going to happen. And I want to be really careful that I'm not implying that I'll be successful. We still have to go through that.
Can we imply it?
You can, but I can't. And I sure you can all imagine this is very surreal for me. This is a weird spot to be in. It's not how I ever saw this thing winding down at all. And trying to do it gracefully in a way that's in harmony with what our residents would expect, given the set of circumstances. I assume everything's good as we do this. I support, and it's easy for me to support anything the council would do that would put the authority in the hands of the chair, and then as quickly as reasonably possible in the hands of the newly elected mayor. And I do think there's some a good discussion around Councilman Stewart's view of readiness. At the same time, if it's in the hands of the chair, I think we all acknowledge it's a little bit of a holding pattern anyway. I mean, the chair's no more prepared, right, than a new mayor would be prepared to move forward on things. So knowing your intent helps me a little bit know how to help you. Does that make sense? Meaning a date, hypothetically, if I'm successful, a date of resignation, there's some flexibility in that. And so the more I know where you would like to go, the easier it makes it for me to complement that in what I would do in moving forward. And let me just emphasize, I'm really comfortable if the short-term steward is the council chair, and then there's a plan in some way to move forward to, at the appropriate time, move that mantle over to the elected mayor.
Are you comfortable sharing kind of the window that you have to work with if that were to happen?
Yeah, hypothetically, right. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to me to resign before there's some type of acknowledgement that the results are accepted. And that could be as early as we see nobody's contested it, or as late as the Board of Canvassers certification, which would be November 20th.
Yeah, the Board of Canvassers, our Board of Canvassers here in the city will certify the results on November 21st, and then it will be the following Monday, November 27th, when the Lieutenant Governor, when the State Board of Canvassers meets, and the Lieutenant Governor actually issues certificates of election. And one of the questions that I've asked the Lieutenant Governor's office but haven't gotten a response back from yet is, absent a resignation, absent a statement that the office is vacant, what's the trigger point in their view? And I haven't gotten an answer back from them on that yet.
It is interesting, though, that in the state code, it does anticipate in the language of it that there are times when you know a resignation is coming and you act anyway, knowing that such that your appointment of a new council member or a new mayor would come after the resignation, or actually it can be effective with the resignation, is what was interesting to me. So this last night I emailed the council and gave them a possible timeline based on actual dates that we have existing right now. We know election day is the 14th or the 7th of November. We know that council meets on the 14th and then again on the 21st. And the 21st of November is when the Board of Canvassers would meet to certify the local elections. And then the very next election next scheduled council meeting is December 5th. And if you operate outside of the December 5th timeline that I showed you as a possibility, you just have to schedule a special meeting to do that.
Mr. Harding.
So you asked about preferences, what would help us out, just as one member of the council. I'm interested in discussion afterwards, but from my point of view, if you could make your resignation effective after December 1st, then kind of getting to what George was just talking about, we actually don't have to appoint anyone. If that's not a possibility, then signaling, at least signaling so that you can notice it on the 21st of November would be the next best option.
I would love to do that. I'm not sure I'll have that prerogative either, based upon federal expectations that might come into play. We've discussed that, and that was kind of why stretching it to the Board of Canvassers on the 27th seemed like, okay, that's logical, that can be explained. That only puts you 3 days out of the window.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I would even be okay leaving today saying, with that understanding that we may be able to stretch it, we may not be able to. But those would be the, at least as I'm looking at it now, that'd be kind of the cutoff. If we can make it to the December 1st, great. If not, then November 21st.
Mr. Stewart.
I would make a motion for the purpose of discussion that we adopt the timeline that Cliff gave us, with the idea that we express our intent so people don't go applying for a job that's not going to be there. I think that would be a shame. If we express the intent of the council as this council chair take over until the new elected mayor can officially be put in temporarily. I don't know if that's enough of a motion or not. But I think we need to signal what's going to happen.
Yes.
As council.
Could you clarify that just a little bit?
Well, I think Cliff gave us a timeline. We do this and this and this, and our intent is that as a council, if this is our intent, I'd like to see a vote on that the newly elected mayor take over when your time expires. As council chair takes it over.
So last night in the email I sent to council, I had suggested this. I suggested that should Mayor Curtis resign prior to November 21st, or on or before November 21st, that staff be authorized to issue notice to a meeting of the council of December 5th at whatever time we set. That persons interested in being appointed to fill the vacancy submit his or her name to be submitted by 5 p.m. on Monday, December 4th to Janine Weiss, City Recorder. That notice would provide or satisfy the conditions of the state law, and of course it becomes moot if that changes. So that's probably a little too specific, but I think what Mr. Stewart is basically just saying is that give us the authorization to move forward with a public notice either at that point or when it becomes clear to us that a resignation is imminent.
For us to do what we need to do, we have to have public notice, that's what I'm trying to get. And I would put the language in, we have an attorney, the council director that can do that. But I think it also needs to include the fact that the intent of the council is to appoint the newly elected mayor as the person.
Yes, I
I
agree.
think that intent needs to be made clear, so we don't get people doing something that we have to vote on. And I think that's a shame.
Can you pull up that suggested intent statement that we have in the SIRE? See if this covers the basis.
Maybe it does.
Just, by the way, this is very easy for me to support, and I think it's a really good path for the council. I agree, sending that signal that is very, very important. I think it's not only important for those who might otherwise apply, but I think it's important for the public to feel like that whoever they elect will get the mantle as quickly as possible. The only possible wrinkle I want to introduce is I may not have the option of waiting until the 21st, so you may get something sooner from me, and I don't think that's precluded, Brian, from.
I think this would take that into account in a sense, and that's, it says no later than November 21st. So if let's say you were to resign before the 21st, the council chair would become the acting mayor until the meeting until the December 5th meeting, and staff could. All that's required is 14 days notice, so we could notice it on the 21st, or we could notice it the day that you resigned.
And if you did this, it would seem better that, in this case, the resignation sooner is actually more helpful to the council from.
As long as it's before the 21st. I think what we're anticipating is that, if you consider the polling and stuff, we should have a good sense by this end of that first week of whether the numbers are close or far. And if they're traditionally the way they have been in the 3rd district in past elections, there should be a sufficient gap that we would have a reasonable expectation of what the result's going to be on the 27th.
It's challenged.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why we, from a staff perspective, we were concerned about November 21st is that we have 2 candidates that emerged out of the primary and a write-in candidate. And theoretically, a person could win the mayoral race with 33.33% plus 1, right? And so there may be there's a higher possibility, I think, that there's a closer result in that race than there will be in the 3rd district.
Yeah, and we saw from the primary and the mayoral's race, we didn't know on the day after. How many days was it before we knew?
10 days or so.
10 days. So that, if it's close, you could be.
And council, if we have to move the notice and to change that timing and stuff because of circumstances around the mayoral race or even the 3rd district race, we have meetings on the 14th and 21st, which we could adjust our timeline if we have to.
I would make this my motion if Brian's okay with it.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. And there's several places in there where, we specifically use language that says it's anticipated that. So if it needs
changes,
we can change it if we need.
Basically, that would be my motion.
I have one question. So the last sentence, the second last, maybe it's the last sentence. While the appointment process will give fair consideration to all, it is the sense of the council this time the most appropriate course of action will be likely to appoint the mayor-elect. Can we change that word and give fair consideration to all will satisfy stated in city law? Because we can't say we're going to give you fair consideration, but this, by the way, is what we're really going to do. It just doesn't quite really work.
Yeah, no, we can totally tweak that. The purpose of that sentence was to say we're not predetermining the outcome. We're not failing to follow state law by completely predetermining the outcome no matter what. Right? Which is why the next part of the sentence says it's currently the sense that the most appropriate course of action will be,
Right.
will likely be, right?
And
it makes
my
a lot of
suggestion
sense if you
is,
look at the timeline, and I think most citizens will get that, but I think
But if you want to
it's,
say, well, the appointment process
I
will
don't know.
follow, will comply with state statute.
yeah, I think that's really what we're doing. We're complying with state statute, but this is the sense of what we feel like we need to do. And I think most people will understand that, the time frame. There's not enough time to.
you might be able to just amend that by saying that while the appointment process will give fair consideration to all, comma, it may result in the council appointing the mayor-elect to serve as
Or
interim
something,
mayor.
given the timeframe, that this, I don't know, something, but it just, it's hard to say we're gonna be fair consideration to all, yet we're really already have our mind made up almost. You know what I mean?
Right, and yeah, so my proposal would probably just be to take, if that's the sense of the whole council, to just take fair consideration to all out and say, well, the appointment process will comply with the state statute.
I want to say state and city.
State and city law. Right?
Also, you need to change it to the interim mayor until the inauguration because it's past the end of the year.
Yes, that's true.
So it could be probably the 5th of January or something like that.
Well, by state statute, they whether they're sworn in or not, they actually take office on the first Monday of January, which is
So
January
it's
1st of
fine.
this year.
It's fine.
Yeah.
Can I also just tell you, I had a phone call from Janelle Pugmire at the Daily Herald yesterday, and she asked the question, why doesn't the council just automatically appoint the mayor-elect? And my answer to her was kind of outlined in what we've talked about already, but basically it comes down to that the state of Utah has outlined a process to follow, and the city council does not want an appointment to be challenged for not following the state's process. And so that's why we want to go through this process rather than, that we were suggesting you go through this process rather than just making a blanket statement or a blanket appointment.
And that brings up another question. Are we truly following state statute if we don't open it up for those who would like to, I mean,
Well,
we're
that's
still-
why you're
we're still
modifying
opening
it.
it up, but to open it up and tell people what our intent is, that doesn't bother, and that doesn't.
Well, it
have any
doesn't bother
problem.
me with this language, which is why it says, at this time, it's the sense that the most appropriate course will likely be. Because I think that gives you plenty of wiggle room. What you're doing is but you are walking a fine line, right? You're walking a line between saying, hey, everybody who has any interest at all should apply because we're going to spend hours debating all of your merits, right? And then you have a whole bunch of people who apply and are offended when after a little bit of consideration you go, well, it doesn't seem like there's any reason not to just appoint the mayor-elect, right? So that's the one extreme. And the other extreme is signaling today that we're going to appoint the mayor-elect even if they don't want to be appointed, right? It's so predetermined that you might as well not even bother submitting your name. So you're trying to, what I sense you're trying to do is walk that line where you're saying, we've got a clear sense that one outcome seems to be the most fair right now, but we're going to follow the process. And as we follow the process, if we determine that something else is more fair and in the best interest of the city, we'll do that. But just so you know in advance, this is what we're thinking right now. That's what the language is intended to do.
It just seems to me that if we're going to follow the state statute, we're going to accept applications, if we're going to follow that, that's our main goal, to follow the state statute, then we do it now. Like we notice it today, we take applications at our next meeting, and we decide who's going to be the interim, and have everything set before, because we can do that, and have someone, prepared for that interim time, and actually follow it the way it's put forward, or we just, I don't know, but I just don't want to give the impression that we're going to follow the state statute, but really we already know what we're going to do. And I know all the intent language is there. I just don't want to walk the fine line. I'd rather follow the state statute. Or
Well, I think effectively you are. You're just saying you'll give consideration to all, but and regardless of this situation's a little different. This is not the mayor or a council member saying, you know what, I've got a new job in New York City that starts on December 1st, and so therefore I'm going to resign on November 30th and I'm done. And we now know ahead of time that we can prepare. We're considering an action if on November 7th the mayor gets elected as a congressman and then is required by congressional rules to resign. So right now we're still in the if, as opposed to the absolute, and therefore I think we have to play it a little differently. But as far as your question goes, I think, yes, we have to give consideration to anybody that applies. But just like other things where council members have been, asked outside of council meeting what they're thinking, whether they would support this action or that action, for council members to state where they want to be, where they think they're going to be is perfectly fine. As long as at the time you come to the council meeting to interview any potential candidates, that you're willing to consider the merits of the case. Now, the qualifications, as I outlined in my email, were simple. They have to be a resident of Provo for the previous 12 months. They have to be a registered voter. And there's a requirement that they're not barred from holding office. And that goes to the issue of felonies and mental status and things like that. And then really, I think if you're interviewing somebody for an office, you would ask them, why do you want to be a member of this office? And I could see an elected the mayor-elect standing up before you and simply saying, well, the voters of Provo have elected me and to start January 1st, and I want to start earlier. So that may be a possibility, right?
Maybe I could clarify a little bit. So my thought is, say we know November 7th, or we know that early.
Yeah.
I guess it wouldn't be canvassed though till later. But I'm just wondering, I'm thinking all the what ifs, right?
Yeah.
I'd rather be prepared. But the 30 days, the mayor resigns, the chair is the interim for 30 days, that period ends and we still don't have an answer on the mayor-elect results. They're being challenged or they're whatever, or for whatever reason, is it possible that could be extended beyond that 30-day period and we find ourselves wondering, I don't know.
I can't think of a circumstance where that would happen. Because you're talking that. So, worst case scenario for the congressional election, Mayor, is that it's so close, or that there is some procedural deficiency, so that some let's say that.
Or he loses.
Well, if he loses, there's no question. Because if he loses, he's still the mayor until the end of the year. Right. So if the results appear that he's won, but there's actually someone actually goes to court and gets a legal injunction forbidding him to be seated in Congress because they think that there's a procedural deficiency in the election, then in that case, the office is not vacant. Because if he's enjoined from taking his seat in Congress, he's still the mayor.
Yeah.
So the only way that the office of mayor ever becomes vacant is if he has actually won and been seated in Congress.
27.
Or later.
Or later.
I understand Mayor Curtis has to leave soon.
I just didn't want anybody to take my departure as anything other than I legitimately have to go. I didn't want it to be interpreted as anything else. I think hopefully I've been clear, and thank you for your deep consideration of this. I do regret I put the city in this position, but I think the really good news is we'll likely have a mayor-elect, and it's just a matter of how we gracefully transfer that power over there. So you have my full support in that, and please excuse me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. And point of procedure, we do have a motion on the table, and we got into discussion before I asked if there was a second. Does your motion still stand, Mr. Stewart?
Yeah.
Well, I'll wait for the second.
Okay, is there a second on the motion?
I'll second the motion.
Okay, now let's continue discussion.
And then can I move for substitute motion to change we'll give fair consideration to all to, we'll follow state and city law, and then the last 5 words instead of until the end of the year should be, oh wait, it is the end of the word.
Can you turn on track changes?
Actually, it doesn't need to change. Until the end of the year is to the end of the term. So just that one. I'd like to make the substitute.
I accept those changes.
Okay.
So delete the word, last sentence, third to last line, where it says give fair consideration to all.
Mm-hmm.
Delete that and replace it with follow state and city law. Or, yeah. Comply with it.
I'm comfortable with that because I think we need to let people know that the council's intent. I think it'd be really unfair to not express an intent. I'm completely comfortable with it.
As a
I agree.
point of procedure, so Let's see. Do we have an amended motion, or did the motion come?
Well, if he amends, I'll re-second his original motion so that, and withdraw my substitute.
Okay, so we have an amended motion from Mr. Stewart and a second from Mr. Hardy.
Is it okay to say follow, or should it say comply with state? So that doesn't matter?
I think they're
I mean, the same
I
thing?
think they're the same, but
Okay.
if there's a preference.
I don't mean to start a big debate about, I just want to know, are we walking a fine line legally or not? With this language and with what we're, with moving forward with this intent, are we on good legal footing?
No, I think
Are we
we're-
walking a fine line?
I think when I was saying fine line, I was talking about that there's a fine line between how you handle this with the public, as far as whether you give them a signal, or whether you leave it completely open and send no signal. That was what I was talking about. Legally, I think this is fine, because you said you will follow state law, but you've given a signal of your sense right now of what a likely outcome may be. I don't think anything in here binds you. It simply tells the public what you're thinking today.
And you can't see in any scenario where we would be left without a mayor. The mayor-elect is done after 30 days, and the mayor-elect, council chair, interim mayor, is done in 30 days, right?
Well, the only way in which okay, I can't foresee a scenario where you're without a mayor. There's a scenario where you might technically be in violation of city law, but I don't think there's any penalty for violating it here. So, and what I mean by that is, you could have a situation where upon the mayor's resignation, the council chair becomes acting mayor, and because of whatever the timeline is, you don't act on the December 5th meeting, and you decide not to hold a special meeting. And so the council chair is actually acting mayor for 35 days or 40 days, which is, if you did that, you're technically violating the city code that says you shall appoint within 30 days, but there's no consequence to that violation, if that makes sense.
Another option is if you can't do it, you can't do it.
Right. I mean, by state code, they would still be the acting mayor. And you haven't violated state code, because state code doesn't give you a firm deadline.
We could change city code if we needed to.
Right, if you needed to, you could repeal that provision of city code. And again, I could make an argument that provision of city code doesn't even apply if he doesn't resign, because that provision of city code doesn't talk about the office being vacant in the same terms as state code does. It just says if there's a resignation, death, or the relocation outside of the city, right? So there's even a technical argument there that you aren't in violation, but you wouldn't be without a mayor, if that makes sense.
And I don't think this binds us to anything. This is just, we're indicating this.
You outlined how the process will be if there needs to be a process.
And if we need to make adjustments, I think it's sort of adjustments.
Mr. Parker, did you have a comment?
Just the question, I think I've already got the timeline kind of figured out. Is there a deadline by which a person must apply? I mean, could they walk in 5 minutes before the meeting starts and make an application?
It's not in this statement, but Cliff had proposed that and I think what this does is it allows staff to craft the notice. And so the deadline will be in the notice.
Yeah.
So, and according to Cliff's timeline, it would be end of the day on December 4th.
It'd be the day
His
before.
proposal.
It didn't specify how long, but it seemed if we're given about 2 weeks, given 13 days to make the application seems reasonable.
I guess my only concern, going back to Councilmember Santiago's concern, is if you have a very close race and you have a recount. Now, again, last time the recount happened within a day or two after the election, presumably between November 21st and December 5th, you may not have a mayor-elect.
Right.
Presumably, all three candidates would apply to be the interim mayor, if that's the case. But again, I would hate for the successful mayor-elect to not make application. Does that make sense?
Right.
And so again, I'm just trying to think through the timeline of that. And you've probably got plenty of buffer between the 21st and the 5th, but lots of strange things happen.
Yeah, and they could always take action on the 20. I mean, we could put out a notice. We could do something in the Board of Canvassers meeting on the 21st to extend the deadline. we could follow this procedure, but at the December 5th meeting, actually continue the final decision
Right.
until a later date and schedule a special meeting. So I think we've got
think you got it covered.
flexibility to handle those.
All right, is there any further discussion on the motion? All in favor? Motion carries unanimously to adopt this intent statement of Mr. Van Buren excused. Thank you. Let's move on to item number 3, presentation on wastewater planning. This will be presented by Mr. Decker.
Elizabeth, do we have the full change for the slide presentation?
I'm sure that's probably true.
Sir Sewell, thank you for the time today. We appreciate you taking the time to, for the entire council and the administration, taking the time to go through this important topic. Given the holiday today and the topic, I wondered if I ought to come in a certain costume. Maybe.
Grim Reaper?
Yeah, that was one of the options. I was thinking, as I looked around the room, some of you may be pulling out your hair by the end of the presentation when you start to see some of the numbers that we're going to talk about today. And
Have as little hair as I have.
yeah, it might. It's a pretty difficult topic, and you can tell by the number of staff members from Public Works that are here. It's one that's going to impact and has impacted a lot of people. They've done a lot of work, and we still have some work to do in getting some more information to the council. But I think it's important to understand what the primary purpose is for the presentation. I feel like this is the second presentation on wastewater issues that are facing the city. And I see at least 2, maybe even more presentations to get more information to the council, and I'll try to help the council understand at the end of the presentation. There's some takeaways from this presentation, but we're not necessarily asking for a final decision. Our main purpose is actually so that the council understands. There is a resolution on the regular session for the work session for the council on the 14th of November. We talked about this last presentation, and it's a requirement if the city wants a variance from the regulations, the nutrient regulations that are coming in 2020. If we want a variance, we have to act by the end of the calendar year. And our primary purpose is for the council to have a good understanding, if we pass that resolution, what path the city will be going down. It's not that we can't backtrack from that resolution, and I'll give some dates. I'll talk about this in the presentation, but very soon, and we're talking spring of 2018, probably about May of 2018, we need to have a firm decision made on the direction that we're going to go relative to nutrient regulations. And you'll see some more information as we go through the presentation. But we feel like it is an absolute need for the council to understand what the resolution means on the 14th of November. And we think we're giving enough information today to understand in these different categories, particularly the financial. We'll spend a lot of time on the finance, the last one, but we're going to touch on every single one of these today in some form or another, so that you understand, are these known, are these solid things that we can bet on? Are there a lot of unknowns? And there are a lot of unknowns in these categories, and the variables and what type of variables that they are in the decision process. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. You can read through it, but we're going to, like I said, we're going to touch on every single one of these topics today in one form or another. So the first one is the nutrient regulations and the timelines. And this is a slide that you saw during the last presentation, and it's a very quick summary. There's not a lot of detail here, but right now our treatment plant discharges the effluent that comes out of the treatment plant after it goes through the process. Our phosphorus ranges between about 2 and 3 milligrams per liter. In 2020, the first set of regulations come into effect from the state. They require treatment plants to be down at the point of about 1 milligram. In fact, it's not about, it's 1 milligram per liter. And it needs to be technology-based phosphorus, some kind of a specific treatment. We can, as I indicated, we can request the state for a variance, and that's the resolution that I mentioned on November 14th. It would allow us to move that 2020 date back to 2025. However, it's important for the council to understand that they would be looking for something more than just chemical treatment. If the city, if the intent of the city is to just use a very basic bare bones approach, which is generally chemical treatment, adding a chemical that gathers the phosphorus together, and you take it out by media, by a filtration process through your media. If that's our intent, they do not want us to ask for the variance and then simply go back to the chemical treatment in 2025. They want something more than chemical treatment, a more advanced process by 2025. So I can't stress that enough. If that is our intent, we have an obligation to meet the first set of regulations in 2020. And that is an option that we'll talk about. We also mentioned the second step in about 2030. We do not have anything in writing. This is one of the unknowns in the regulation side, but in about 2030, the word that we're getting, they intend to take a second step that would regulate phosphorus somewhere in the range of 0.05 to 0.5 milligrams per liter. There are other unknowns relative to the regulations. We do not, there's discussions about nitrogen. There's other nutrients that have been talked about from the state. There's discussions, if you, particularly if you look outside of the state of Utah, there's regulations that start to talk about pharmaceuticals in the wastewater stream that right now we're not removing, and those regulations may mature, you know, in the next 12 or so years, and we may see additional regulations in 2030 that talk about other additional regulations and things that we need to remove from the effluent. The next topic that was on that list, I should ask, are there any questions on that slide? Please.
So these, by state law, this is measured, I forget the term for it, but right at the end of the treatment plant.
End of the pipe.
End of the pipe. That's where it's measured. Previously, you talked about, you know, some new creative ways of addressing this, and it sounds like the state is open to some of those things. We are making decisions, or we're contemplating decisions now, and it seems to me that the concern is what's happening at Utah Lake, the nutrient level in Utah Lake. What percentage of our effluent is used at the golf course? We heard like 80–90% of what they use comes from the treatment plant, but how much of it goes from the end of the pipe and then goes to the lake, and how much of it gets diverted there? It just seems like one way to treat this creatively is to use that water for irrigation, and now, you know, it's probably not even enough to be considered, you know, considered fertilizer, but I mean, it's helping to fertilize, and how much of it's actually getting to the lake, and could we get credits, or could that be under consideration because it's not actually reaching the lake?
So if I can rephrase your question, what I think you're asking is how much do we pump out of the mill race, because our effluent goes into a mill race, the mill race goes through the golf course, and we pump some of that out to use in, or we pipe it actually directly to the golf course, and they use it in their sprinkling system.
Yes.
How much of our effluent goes there? I don't know if the staff has a specific number, but I would venture to guess it's not very much. And the reason I say that, our treatment plant on an average right now, we treat about 14 to 15 million gallons a day. Mark is in the back here, and if I step out of line, he'll stop me. But 14 to 15 million gallons a day, every single day, that's a lot of water to put on the lawn at the golf course. I seriously doubt we're using more than 5%, and it's probably less than that.
Yeah, thank you.
There was another question.
I just wondered if you had a timeline on when the state was going to decide on that 2030 target, if they'd given an indication.
I wish they would. That is one of the most difficult challenges for the staff is we do not have a lot of concrete future dates from the state or even future knowns. And legitimately, I have to be careful here because I think the state is trying to back up a little bit and say there are some legitimate concerns that the treatment plants have raised. And they're trying to do some studies and make it scientific based and not just say, well, we're going to follow the federal EPA regulations and ignore, what may logically or scientifically may be legitimate for Utah Lake. And so their efforts to make it science based is adding to the unknowns. Please.
So how clean is this water compared to river water or irrigation water? I mean, I like Mr. Harding's suggestion. What if, could it be used on crops? Could it be used for farms? People are saying we don't have enough water. Could it be used as irrigation, or is it not to that level of, I mean, it's going to the lake, so it's got to be pretty darn clean, right?
I think it generally, I mean, when we're talking about, especially the first step, we're probably in the realm of most secondary water use. I don't, again, I'll look to staff if I'm stepping out of line here, but we're probably, that first step would probably be pretty close to most secondary water quality standards, and maybe even a little bit better than most secondary water quality standards.
So we don't know when they're going to decide about the 2030, and we also don't know when they're going to decide on regulations for nitrogen, other nutrients, pharmaceuticals. But is it possible that they would decide some or all those things at once, or is it going to maybe be drawn out piecemeal? Do we have any clue?
If I would to guess, my sense is that they will give us a piecemeal approach. I don't think that we will see everything in one set of regulations. I think, and particularly with the pressure that they're starting to feel from the treatment plants. I mentioned the Wasatch Front Water Quality Group that has, it's basically a group of treatment plants that have come together, cities and special improvement districts. And I think they're sensing that they need to make some good, sound decisions. And I don't think it's all going to come in one regulation. I think we'll see it over a period of time. I think the one thing that I would back up just a bit on the question about secondary reuse, and it is actually a topic that we'll talk about here in more detail. But I think we need to also keep in mind the state, and again, if you look outside the state of Utah, you see this happening with other states. They have not, regulations have not stopped with wastewater. They will often turn, or likely turn, to stormwater and to farm use, agriculture, and other places. We'll eventually see similar regulations so that if a farm is having a certain amount of phosphorus or nitrogen coming off the farm, they will start to regulate agriculture as well. So it's not simply a matter of saying, well, let's put it all on grass someplace, and figure out how to use 15 million gallons. And then the runoff still from that grass still contaminates the natural waters of Utah Lake or Provo Bay. We're going to catch the regulations. I believe we're going to get the regulations in one form or another at some point.
Just real quick, and I know this isn't the main topic and there's much more to look into, but I think that the idea is not, well, let's just dump it somewhere and then it trickles in and so it doesn't actually do anything. But by irrigating farms and whatnot, those nutrients would actually be put to use.
Benefit.
And it gets filtered before it hits the lake. And so that was where that thought was. But maybe this is some points too.
Yep. And we'll talk a little bit as we go further in. We will talk about a potential engineered wetland in the golf course area, where we intentionally are using wetlands to filter out nitrogen and phosphorus, and it's one of the options that we need to consider. I have to tell you though, most of that approach, and we'll talk about this, that approach is likely going to meet the first set of regulations, probably not the second step of regulations. And that's the concern, is we have some options in the first step, and they're less expensive options, but does it set us up for a problem in the second step? Any other questions on this one? So the next topic we wanted to cover is the age of the treatment plant. And again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail unless there's some questions, but we have highlighted in red, we've highlighted the key components at our existing treatment plant relative to the nutrient removal. And we've indicated the ages here and any upgrades that have happened on that particular facility. You can see some of the facilities have been upgraded relatively recently, 2005. You know, there's some dates there that are pretty recent. There's also some dates, you know, particularly the digesters along the north or the top part of this graphic. There's some dates that are in the 76 range. There's some dates in the 50s still, when the treatment plant was originally built, and we've maintained those facilities but not made any significant upgrades to those facilities. And the age of the treatment plant is one of the major concerns that we have in the conversation at the end of the presentation. When we talk about options, one of the options that we look at is upgrading and rehabilitating our current treatment plant. One of the big negatives about it is the age of the treatment plant. We can upgrade these facilities, we can rebuild a lot of the facilities, particularly the items that are above ground. It's much more difficult to upgrade piping. The piping's not shown on this graphic, but you have to understand that there's pipes, huge pipes, that run between most of these facilities. And I think it's safe to say, Mark, again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that any of those pipes have had any rehabilitation work. They've been maintained, but not rebuilt. So we have pipes that are in 1956. Yeah.
We're still using the 56 infrastructure underground.
So I think that's, again, one of the components to keep in mind as we go through. Any questions on this slide?
So, yeah, sorry, the
okay.
the clarifiers and the aeration basins those are current. That's what's currently being used right now.
Yes.
And the trickling filters that are going to be taken away, right? They're no longer being used.
And actually, everything that's on the map is still currently used. The trickling filters, even though they're X'd out, that we still use the trickling filters in the current process. But as far as an effective nutrient removal process, the trickling filters don't help us. So we would effectively abandon, if we go through option 1 and rehab the current treatment plant, the trickling filters are gone. We would take them out. Just a quick note about our collection system, and again, this is mostly on the west side. There are some age issues on the west side as far as the collection system, and where this starts to play into the conversation and consideration, particularly for staff, there is some issues we call I&I. It's infiltration and inflow, and it's basically a pipe that is able to take groundwater from high groundwater from outside the pipe, and it leaks into the pipe, and it makes a difference in our treatment process. We're taking really water that's not wastewater, and because it leaks into that pipe, it gets gathered up, and we take it to our treatment plant, and we take it through the process of treating it, and it dilutes the waste. And it actually decreases our ability to effectively treat wastewater. And we identify, we know that we have some issues there. This is a very difficult problem to track down. When we did the presentation to Wayne the other day, he asked some questions about, is this something that we need to pursue more aggressively? And the answer is yes. We have done a reasonable job, but probably not everything that we could do as far as tracking down the I&I issues. But you need to also understand how difficult it is to find these problems. We generally, especially over the last 5 years, with the exception of the last year, we've had drought situations, so that we've had a decrease in the water table, which makes it almost impossible to find I&I problems in a pipe. The water table just simply isn't high enough to be leaking into the pipe. Or if you identify the problem, it's a minor, so it appears for a while to be a very minor problem. So we have to have high groundwater, we have to have, you know, certain weather conditions, we have to be looking in the springtime. There's a lot to finding I&I problems in the collection system. But I think it's important to understand that's one of the components that we are considering. And again, age of the pipe is one of the factors in I&I. We're going to come back and talk a little bit about the 5-year CIP. I'm going to actually skip this slide, and when we talk about the financial considerations at the end of the presentation, we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the 5-year CIP. I think it is important to understand, though, this is an exact copy of what the council saw last budget year of the 5-year CIP, and there's some components, some things that we've highlighted, and some changes that probably need to be made to the 5-year CIP. We'll come back.
Highlights of the yellow.
These are specific topics that pertain to decisions. So the highlights on the yellow are numbers that we have set aside for the next 5 years for improvements. So that we have a major project that's going on the west side. Horrocks Engineers is designing a lift station and a large collection system we talked with the council about. It primarily follows the Lakeview Parkway alignment. It goes up kind of the very western boundary of the city. And this is a project that potentially eliminates 5 either existing or planned lift station and combines them all into one lift station. It's a master lift station. We've talked with the council a little bit about that, but that's the funding for that project right there. And we're going to talk in more detail about that. This is also one of the lift station lines where there's some lift stations that need some rehabilitation on the west side. They're older lift station. And we'll, again, talk about this. These are more in line with our conversation financially that we'll talk about with the treatment plant options. So again, I feel like it's a little premature to talk too much about this slide. We need to come back and cover this in more detail.
That was 28,000, now we're really 28 million, now we're talking more.
Yes.
A lot more.
Yes, a lot more. Yeah. This is the part about pulling out your hair.
Over a longer period of time.
Yeah. This is a slide that the council saw some detail on it in the last presentation. I think it's a little bit, we wanted to spend a little bit more time with the council, so particularly they understand the issues on the west side of Provo and how our system functions and some bottlenecks. We talked quite a bit in the previous presentation about the 36. I think you've heard quite a bit, hopefully understanding that the master plan back in 2013 identified some problems on the west side, and the 36 was one of the components. They indicated that at the time we had about 2,150 residential, single-family residential units available in capacity for that existing 36. And we talked last time that roughly 1,500 of those units have been allocated someplace on the west side. Broadview Shores took about 1,200. 300 of them went to other various smaller developments. And so we have roughly 600 units left on, from a capacity standpoint, on the existing 36-inch line. And we'll talk a little bit more when we talk 5-year CIP. There's some other limitations, though, on the west side that I think is important for the council to understand. Please.
When did you discover that you only had 600, capacity for 600? It seems like we've been told, as far as I can remember, that there was capacity for 4 units per acre. That's kind of what we've been going by as far as development since I've been on the council. But now, if you only have 600, the capacity for 600, how long have we known that?
Well, since the master plan was completed in 2013, when we adopted the master plan, these bottlenecks were identified in the master plan, and we whether we've communicated clearly or not, this is part of the 5-year CIP. This is why, I guess I can go back to the 5-year CIP. This is exactly why this line showed up on our 5-year CIP, was because we knew the master plan identified this as a problem, and they came back with the master plan in 2013 and said, you got to have a parallel 36 plan, and in order for you to meet capacity at full build out. And when I say full build out, the assumptions that they've made for the master plan on the west side of Provo is 4 units per acre. If that changes, and you got to remember that's an overall 4 units per acre. If that changes and densifies, goes to 6 units or 8 units, some of the assumptions in the master plan need to be adjusted.
It sounds like that's already changed dramatically, so it needs to be adjusted today, right? Because we don't have that capacity any longer, unless we have a 36-inch parallel.
Right, right. The 36 that was recommended in the master plan was based on 4 units per acre on the west side. And so what they're saying is, yeah, you've got 2,100 units left, and most pipes have, you know, there's limitations on every single pipe in our system. And they just identified this as a bottleneck and said, you need to plan for some additional capacity in this 36 so that you can move the water from the west side to the east side over to your treatment plant. And that's kind of the reasoning. That's one of the primary reasons for a master plan. But they told us that in 2013, and that's exactly why we came back to the council and said, we need to start saving. That project was identified somewhere between $8 and $9 million. And we said, we need to start saving for that project. And that's why that line showed up in our 5-year CIP.
How much have we saved since we're 9?
The first year, that's, Jimmy, am I correct? The first year was this fiscal year. We've set aside $1 million.
And that savings, that 36 parallel will then get us to 4.
Yes. Please.
That 36 parallel, does that go through the sleeve that's under the freeway over by Powerline Park?
That is correct.
So right now you're saying 2,100 and some of it's used, so we have 600 left. If we have a wet year and we get that infiltration coming back in, do we really have 600?
That's one of the main concerns that we have, and staff is spending a lot of time right now. That's one of the things that we understand in the council. I think it's important for the council to understand is these numbers are based on computer models, and we're working really hard to calibrate those models right now. So we have insertion meters that can go into the pipe. They're movable insertion meters, and you can get several days up to a week's worth of data, and then you look at that information and say, how close does that data match the information that's coming from our models? And we may find that it's significantly less, and we have more capacity than the 2150 that our master plan indicated. But the information that we have gone so far tells us that the model is pretty darn close. Now, the INI that I mentioned before, if anything, the INI is going to lessen the capacity that we have. And again, we have not had a lot of years, other than 2011 and the spring that we just went through, we have not had a lot of years that I would say are really good benchmarks for INI problems to be identified.
So if we build out now to the max, it's allowable by approving a project out there. And then the next 5 years before we get the new sewer line in place, we have a wet year, we're over the top.
We need to build a factor of safety. If that's the approach that we take, right now, our recommendation from staff would be that we don't have enough information to clearly identify what the INI potential problem is, and we need to build some safety factor into that pipe.
Into the pipe or into the number of units we approve?
Well, yes, one or the other. We either need to be careful about how many units we approve, or we've got to move faster on the pipe so that we have more capacity sooner.
It seems to me that we can approve a lot more units than we could, we can approve units much faster than you can build that pipe, even if you accelerate that.
Please.
It's my understanding from a conversation this morning that potentially even some of those 600 are already or could be committed. I think there's an area that's zoned R1A that if it's built out, wouldn't even come to council and could take up some of those units.
I'm not aware of the specifics. Gary's shaking his head back there, though.
And the other thing that I learned this morning is of the remaining 400 or 500 or whatever, 400 uncommitted, that we've already got projects that are in various stages that are a lot more than that.
You'll see that on the next
Okay,
slide.
go ahead. Sorry.
Please.
If I could just kind of introduce that. I wasn't here when the master plan was done, so that number was there. You know, and I understand that, but you know, we've been considering and recently have approved some fairly large some projects. I've been pretty involved with trying to plan out and set policies for West Provo. When I heard that 600 just a few weeks ago, that to me was a bombshell. I had not taken that into consideration. You know, we had lots of meetings with our policy committee. That didn't come up, and you know, so I guess it's just I'm glad we know it now. I wish we had known it sooner, because quite honestly, this would have played into my weighing out of some of these previous projects. And you know, it sounds like we're still getting some more information. I'm glad that we're talking about it now, but I would just say to the council, I think you know, a lot of what we were doing with the West Provo Planning Committee, we were looking out 40 years, 50 years. I think we need to have a really clear vision plan for the next 7, how we're going to get through this. You know, you know, are there potential? Are we looking at a terminal at the airport? If we get someone that wants that freeway commercial, I mean, I could see us having to say no to projects that we really want because of this infrastructure. So I think we need, you know, outside of this conversation, I think we need to get the information, and then we need to set some policies and have it so we can communicate to these developers and communicate to the neighbors, you know, what the plan is, because to me this really shifts the reality for the next 7 years.
Let me continue through the presentation, because if we focus too much on where we've stopped right now in the presentation, one of the messages that you may be tempted to take away is we're saying stop development on the west side, and that's not the message that we're sending. You know, as you see the presentation move forward, we're giving some options in order to allow development to move forward. And the picture that we're talking about isn't quite as bad. I'm going to try to be careful here, because there are some other bottlenecks that I'm concerned about, and we need to finish talking about this before we get too far along. But before we talk about some of the other bottlenecks, it's important to understand, out of the 2,100, I mentioned specifically Broadview Shores for a reason, because we committed 1,200 units to Broadview Shores. Well, right now they only have about 300 units built, and it's taken them a number of years. Shane has pointed this out a number of times. Probably 3 years now that we've gotten about 300 units. So you have to understand that, yes, we've, you know, officially committed that 1,200 units to Broadview Shores, but they haven't taken up 1,200 units, and it probably will be a number of years before they get to 1,200 units, several years, and maybe more. And so I think it's important not to get too carried away in the numbers. You know, we've got some wiggle room, but I don't think it's good policy to just simply say, well, let's just open the floodgates without a plan either. And so that's what we're trying to say. We need to have a plan moving forward. So let me explain, you know, some of these other areas, and I'm going to back up just a tad and hopefully help the council understand how our system works. We're going to start up here by Broadview Shores and the new high school, and that area is illustrated. It's actually in that brown tan color that's highlighted, and that area basically drains to one lift station, and the lift station is identified in the yellow circle right there. And it has a force main. It pumps it into a force main, and it moves it over into the green area that's right next to it. And it drops it into the gravity system, and it drains to another lift station that's highlighted right here. So all of this green area comes to this lift station called Skipper Bay. And that one picks it up, forces it into this area right here, which gathers into this lift station, and it forces it over into the existing 36. So in some places on the west side, we actually pump our waste 3 times. And that's one of the advantages that why we're moving forward with trying to get a master lift station so that most of those lift stations can be eliminated, at least many of them. But the thing that is important to understand are in the master plan, it identified capacity issues with those lift stations as well. So they indicated that in this area right here, we have about 350 equivalent units, which probably has largely been taken up by Broadview Shores right now. Now, there are some possibilities of updating, and that's why you see in the 5-year CIP, this slide right here, that's exactly why that line item is highlighted right there, because that intent of the line item was to upgrade some of those lift stations so that we can get the capacity needed and identified in the master plan. But I think it's important to understand that those were the different bottlenecks. We had the same issue with this west side. Basically, the entire west side of Provo goes through the west side lift station. And in 2013, they identified we had about 1,500 units or so left, again, based on modeling information. So we're getting really tight in some of our lift stations and need to either move forward with the master lift station project or upgrade the existing lift stations. I do have to tell you, we probably have not clearly communicated, particularly those 2 bottlenecks, with the council. In the west side planning, I felt like as a department, we did at least one presentation for the west side planning group. And I know this was not the focal point of that west side planning group, but we came and we talked in pretty specifics with that west side about the challenges on the west side with water and with wastewater. Water, we felt like we're moving in the right direction. We're pretty close with the 2 tanks and the lines that have been built with those associated with those 2 tanks. But we gave some pretty good information, I think, to the West Side Planning Group so that they understood we're going to run into a problem fairly quickly on the 36. So let me now move forward with the collection system that is being proposed with that Horrocks is moving forward with. And as I indicated, there's a master lift station plan right here adjacent to the west side, the Lakeview Parkway near the airport. We're running north and intercepting. This is in close proximity to the west side lift station that I indicated. And we're running at a grade so that we can intercept on a gravity system. So we no longer have to pump with that west side lift station so that we could eliminate that west side. We then go over to 3110 West. We have a line that branches out, goes over to Duncan Aviation, which we made a commitment to provide in 2019 sewer service.
Can I ask you a question? As
Yes.
you described those, is the first one reflective of that $5 million cost?
That is.
So
Horrocks is.
we can follow 1 to 1, 2 to 2.
Yes. They're color coded, and each of those dollar amounts is the cost estimate that Horrocks Engineers has given to the staff on those amounts. So this line goes over to Duncan Aviation. We've planned a line. It's not one that we plan to build immediately, but they've done enough design work to know that we can give a gravity system, and it's important to know that we're planning a gravity system here all the way over to the Utah State Park. There are some other gravity lines that potentially could come, this direction toward a new terminal at the airport. Again, this is a line that's deep enough, based on the information that we've got from Horrocks right now, that we could eliminate lift stations, the use of lift stations, with the exception of one master lift station right here. The line is planned to follow the alignment of the Lakeview Parkway, as I indicated. We have a line that goes over and intercepts as a gravity line the Skipper Bay. We also intercept this line on, I think this is 620 North, and it continues up to the high school. It does not eliminate the lift station that's right at the very northwest corner. We cannot get deep enough to eliminate that lift station by the high school. That's generally that's the general location that I can say. So that lift station is not eliminated. You can see the cost for the lines only. It's about $17 million. That does not include the lift station. The master lift station was estimated around $4 million. Please.
So cottages at Bayview, trunk line, that's our cost, are they contributing?
This one right here, this yellow line,
Well, so this says section 9, gravity line from cottages at Bayview to trunk line, 1.27.
so this line, we asked Horrocks to look at the line and get a concept plan design so that we are sure that we can get a gravity line from this area back to that lift station. That is not saying, and they gave us a cost estimate for it, but that's not saying that the city has to pay for that. We're just saying in order for this network of pipes to be built, this is how much money we're going to spend total. It's not assigning who's going to spend that money.
The other question I have is, it would seem like there's probably some number of millions being spent to provide water and sewer to Broadview shores, and I don't know how much we're getting back in like impact fees to cover supplying those services to that subdivision or project. Do you have any idea of the return we're getting on the money?
We have not run specific numbers. I can't tell you specifically what the impact fees, would generate in Broadview Shores versus, what has been built. I would say that, particularly relative to the water and the water tanks, the tanks were not specifically built for Broadview Shores. That was not, that was not even the thing that pushed the needle over, and said, oh, you got to build the water tanks. The master plan for the water system came back, and irregardless of Broadview Shores, they said development on the west side, you've got some issues that you need to address from a fire flow storage, from a storage standpoint, from multiple different issues, and they came back with the recommendation for the 2 tanks. So it was not unique to Broadview Shores that we did the water tank projects. I do have to say, as a general comment about impact fees, and it's partly why the council is looking at impact fees and the administration is supportive of that investigation. Our impact fees have not been updated for a long period of time, and we're probably not generating what potentially we could if they had been updated. So any questions on this slide here? So one of the reasons, when we talked with the council about this project early on, one of the reasons that we favored and strongly recommended this to the council, in addition to eliminating the collection or the pump stations, this site and getting one location where a master plan, a master lift station could be identified, it is a potential site and a collection system that could be used for a new treatment plant. And we're going to spend some time on the treatment plant itself at this point. Before we do that, this was the slide that somebody had asked a question about development and requests for development. Some of these have not been officially filed with the city, some of them have, but this is just a slide that shows some, not all, some of the development that has started to either be seen, talked about, applied for through community development. And it's clear we have more units in the hopper, in some form in the hopper, than we have capacity in the 36. So we need to be cautious. And again, you need to keep in mind, Broadview Shores hasn't used, and other developments haven't used all the capacity that's been allocated. So there's still some play in those numbers. But again, we need to be thinking, very clearly and have a good, clear plan so that we don't get caught thinking, oh, we're just going to let development continue forward and not have a plan to accommodate the capacity when homes are built. So the next two slides talk a little bit about some of the unknowns, and I'm not, you can read through these. I'm not going to spend time on every single bullet point that's here. There's probably a few that I'll mention, but these are some of the unknowns. These are some of the very difficult issues that the staff is trying to weigh out, and some of them are known, some of them are unknowns. They all play into our decision. This is one that I'm going to mention right here very quickly. There's a concern, and the state is aware of it. State officials actually have a calculation. It's called the MAGI calculation, and it looks at the average residential income in each of the cities, and they have a number. It's 1.04% of the average income for a home, and their indication is that if a monthly sewer bill is over 1.4% of a resident's average income, that may be considered unusually high. That's kind of their boundary, where they say if you're higher than that, you're probably pushing outside a reasonable amount for a monthly sewer bill. And it's one of the main considerations in Provo. We have a fairly low residential family income, and so our calculation for that MAGI is relatively low, and we're starting to push up against that. We're not there, but we're getting close.
So it would seem that the cost for each household per month would be impacted if we are not collecting impact fees for development and deferring those costs to the general populace and on their bills each month.
Impact fees are clearly one of the components. We need to be careful though about the calculations. When we did the presentation for Wayne, we ran some numbers, and they are rough numbers, admittedly. This is partly why I feel like we need to come back with much stronger, much tighter financial information for the council. And this is an area where we feel like we can nail down some more solid information for the council. But even if we ran, I think it was, Gary, help me here, we assumed 5,000 units on the west side.
5,000 units at $3,000 per unit. That's still $15 million.
So it does generate $15 million. But when you start to see the numbers for the treatment plant and even the collection system, you've seen the numbers for the collection system, it's not going to build the whole thing. Please.
With the collection system, I could see suggesting that, you know, the developments there need to help pay for it. The treatment plant, I mean, if those new buildings are going to affect the capacity that's needed, but the treatment plant needs to be rebuilt anyways. We shouldn't.
You can't put that on.
Couldn't consider that as, you know, for impact fees. Just a quick question on the MAGI. Is that, you know, that magic line in the sand, is that the point at which if we start going over, the state starts slapping our hand and saying, don't do that? Or is that the point at which they start saying, we want you to meet these regulations and we're going to give you some money to help you do that because you're at this MAGI line?
It's more in line. I don't know that I go as far as you went on the second option, but it's more in line with that, where they're not going to come back and say, well, don't do that, city, because you're passing that line. But it does open some opportunities for us to go and say, is there some flexibility in regulations because we've exceeded that MAGI, or is there grant money? Is there other, you know, options that the state can offer to us? And it does help the state feel better. You know, if we can demonstrate we've crossed that line, it does help the state, you know, feel better about offering assistance or variances or something like that in the future. So we're going to continue because we're going to run out of time here if we spend too much time. Again, these are mostly unknowns, and we've covered a lot of them already in the presentation. But I want to reiterate some of the concerns that we have. We do not know what the state is going to do with future regulations. My concern is that looking at other states and what they're doing, the state is and they told us they're sensing a lot of pressure from the federal EPA to kind of follow along. So when you see things happening in California, Arizona, the Midwest to address phosphorus and nitrogen issues. My sense is it's only a matter of time when it's going to come to Utah. One of the other concerns that we've talked about with the council, in the latest report to the federal EPA, the state separated Provo Bay from Utah Lake and elevated Provo Bay and basically gave us a pretty good indication that Provo Bay may see higher regulations than Utah Lake will in the future. And right now, our effluent from our treatment plant goes to Provo Bay. We talked a little bit about pharmaceuticals, and one of the things that that I think is important to understand is potential reuse of the effluent, and we talked a little bit about secondary water and water quality. We'll cover that a little bit more here. One of the other things that we need to keep in mind in the council, individual council members have brought this up, and again, this is a largely an unknown. Is there intervention from someone? State legislature probably is the most obvious place, but does the state legislature intervene and say, hey, we've got state officials that are being unreasonable for whatever reason, and we're going to intervene and put a more difficult process that delays the regulations. And that might happen. It might not, though. And again, it's one of those unknowns for the staff. So
You think it's likely to happen?
I don't know. Part of me would like to say yes, that if I think it's more likely if studies that happened on Utah Lake and other water bodies, if they came back and said, hey, this water body is not going to respond as the state anticipates in the future by regulating certain chemicals, this water body is not going to likely respond in the way they anticipate. I would anticipate that changes in the regulations would more likely occur in that circumstance.
Given the costs.
Yes. But if the studies come back and say, yes, the water body would respond in some positive way, the likelihood of the state stepping in or someone else stepping in and changing the regulations diminishes significantly.
Right now, the state regulators are saying they don't have the science to back it. When are they saying they're going to have that science?
So we've initiated some through various components, through various agencies that we belong to. We've initiated some studies on Utah Lake. We're probably at least 2 and maybe 3 years away from results of those studies.
It was probably fair to say, Dave, though, that even with state legislative intervention, it probably only prolongs the agony. You may have more time to respond, and therefore it'd be less expensive in chunks, but at the end of the day, you probably still have to meet these standards.
And I tend to agree with Wayne, and I don't know why Wayne, you know what, in his mind, why he says that, but in mine, I keep looking again at the industry in other locations, particularly, you know, California, Arizona, Midwest. I see these regulations being done more aggressively, and they started years ago, and Utah just tends to be a little bit behind in the regulations, and I think you know, unless there's some really rock solid science that says this water body is not going to respond the way we would anticipate, I think the regulations will come.
So is there no difference between the Obama administration and the Trump administration? Because with energy, I know that they were very strong on these requirements. It seemed like they lifted those for energy plants. So is there any chance that things might be relaxed on the federal level? Is there any talk about it?
Yes, there's conversations about it. There's talk about it. I have not seen any action on it. Anything that even looks like, you know, something's going to happen in the near future. So I'm a little hesitant to say, hey, we should hold out hope or delay actions on the part of the city, hoping that the federal, you know, government changes some approach. Right now, I don't see anything that indicates that that's a good chance.
We're one city on the lake. How are the other cities starting here? This is I'm scared. How are other cities responding to this?
So some cities, some districts are ahead of us. We tend to be, right now, I would say the Provo's not on the leading edge, but we're probably in the front group that is moving forward on it. One agency that's further ahead on Utah Lake than we are is the Timpanogos Special Improvement District. And they've actually reported to the council probably a year or more ago. John Adams from Timpanogos came. He indicated that they had already taken steps to address the first set of regulations coming. It cost Timpanogos about $80 million to address the first steps.
80?
80 million. That was what John reported. And he's going to the council. Mark?
86.
How big is that district?
So Timpanogos takes in most of North Utah County, so everything west of the lake, Saratoga Springs, Eagle Mountain, Lehigh, American Fork, Highland, everything that's north. Linden, I think, is the boundary. So Linden goes into Orem City. So basically north of Linden is going into Timpanogos.
So there may be twice our city's population would be that district.
Pretty close. I think their district population is 140 maybe.
Oh, so just a little over.
Just a tad over what we are.
And how are they addressing it? Is it new plants? Are they building a plant or what's their?
They are modifying their existing treatment plant. So their treatment plant is much newer than Provo City's, and they are going down the option 1 route that I'm going to talk about, and they're modifying their existing plant either through chemical or changing their process so that they can take out more phosphorus in their overall process. So I think this is just a little bit of a conversation about the Horrocks project. So we're going to shift gears and talk about the treatment plant for just a minute here, because the treatment plant options definitely play into the collection system, and we've made it clear, I think, with the council that the collection system has the potential for, instead of a master lift station, to put a treatment plant in the future at that location, and we'll cover 4 options, and I think it's important for the council to understand the first 3 were developed largely over the last 3 or 4 months in conjunction with consultants, and we spent a lot of time on the options. Option 4 was largely developed just recently, as I got a little bit nervous about some of the numbers that I was seeing in the first 3 options, and we're gonna talk about these 3 options. So the first one is upgrading our current treatment plant where it sits today and trying to meet the phosphorus requirements by 2020 or the variance by 2025. The second option is a phased-in approach so that we keep our existing facility running for a number of years, at least till 2030, maybe a little bit beyond that, and we start to build a smaller treatment plant that can be expanded on the west side, probably at the location of the master lift station that's part of the Horrocks project. Option 3 is construction. Just cut all the challenges out and just say we're going to build a brand new lift station or a brand new treatment plant, and we're gonna spend all the money. We're not going to do anything at our existing treatment plant. We're just going to make a big leap and build a brand new treatment plant. And the fourth option is a phased approach, similar to option number 2, where we keep our existing facility running, we do minimal improvements at our facility. So the way I described it to Mark, and he doesn't necessarily like this description, but we're putting our existing facility on life support. And we're admitting that we're going to abandon that facility at some point in the future, and we're just barely keeping it going. Option 4 does have one feature, and I'll describe why we pursued option 4 a little bit more. One of the assumptions, and I think it's important to understand, there are some variables in the assumption that you probably ought to have some questions about. But our effort in putting these assumptions together is to try to get an apples to apples comparison so that you know if we pass the resolution on the 14th of November, one of these options probably will be what we pursue, or some variation on these options. And there's lots of variables in these, but again, we try to keep the variables consistent. And I don't want, this is one of the hazards of doing this, I don't want anybody to walk out and say, hey, this is exactly what we're going to get for interest rates on bonds, or this is exactly what we're going to do for rate increases, anything like that, because it's largely an effort to make good sound assumptions based on today's knowledge, but it doesn't mean that those variables may change in the future. So I think we want to be careful about the numbers. So the assumptions we've made, we're looking out to 2049. I know that's a long ways in the future, but we're forced to do that because the treatment plant is such a big expense. The options of all four options include a $200,000 increase in operations, which is consistent with what we're seeing today. John Borgett and some of our staff spent a lot of time over the last couple of years looking at increases in insurance and typical operation costs, and we feel like that's a good sound number in today's dollars to make those assumptions. We've also assumed in all four options we have $3 million per year in the collection system, and that's for CIP projects. That's important to note that that includes new pipes and rehabilitation of current pipes. So dealing with I&I, things that we've already talked about, that's coming out of $3 million. And we have a cap of $3 million to build new pipes and rehab our system. We've also assumed rate increases that are consistent with the 5-year plan that the council has seen. So next fiscal year in 19, we have a 19% increase. In 20, we have a 15% increase. And then we have 3% increases in 21 and 22. But those are consistent in all four options, with one exception in option 4. And the options that include bonding, they all assume a 30-year bond, which is longer than what we typically do. Finance, John Borgett and his staff pointed out that this is not a typical approach for the city. We usually try to do a shorter period, 20, sometimes even shorter. But in this particular case, we, again, to try to get an apples-to-apples comparison, we've assumed a 30-year bond, an interest rate of 2.8%. And just so for comparisons, the bond that we took out in 2015, we got a 2.68%. So I don't think we're too far off in current dollars. So option 1, upgrading our existing facility. Here are some of the challenges that it presents. We have a 1.5, in addition to the increases that we've assumed in all the base options. Starting in 2023, we have a 1.5% annual increase through 29, and we have a 1.9%, almost 2%, from 30 all the way out to 2049. We also have 2 bonds, a $10 million bond in FY20, which is only a couple of years away. We have a $17 million bond in 29. And this is our fund balance, this graph right here. If I need to move this back so you can see it. This is our fund balance graph. And you can see twice we're bouncing well below 0. So we have a negative fund balance in 2 different circumstances. And we would have to, if we wanted to keep it positive, we would have to make further adjustments. It's important. We try to reach basically the same point on all 4 options. And again, trying to make an apples-to-apples comparison, that's what we've done. We'll come back and talk a little bit about some of the challenges. I think I've already given you a pretty strong hint. The existing facility, we're concerned about the age, and we're going to spend a lot of money in bonds at the existing facility, and by 2049, we're still going to have pipes in the ground because those expenses, those bonds would not pay for rehabilitation of the pipes, the underground work. So some of our facility would still be built in 1953. So we'd have 100-year pipes by the time we reach the end of this comparison. And other components.
Talk bond, are you talking revenue?
Revenue bond. Yes. So option 2 And we have these comparisons. Jimmy can pull it up on a spreadsheet so you can see them side by side if you want. But in option 2, where we phase in a new facility, we have a 1% increase planned from 23 to 36 and just a tad over a 2.7% increase from 37 to 49. We have 3 bonds in this option that we would be forced to do. We have a $40 million bond in FY20, again, just a couple of years away. We have an $85 million bond in 29 and a $50 million bond in 37. And it would require that simply because we're building a new facility, trying to keep our old facility up and going through at least 30 or 35. And each of those phases would require us to expand out on the west side a new treatment plant. And so we would phase in the treatment plant, but it would cost us and force us to bond in each case as we expanded that facility on the west side. We'll talk about, well, let me finish option 3 and then we'll come back and talk. This is the one that we just say we're going to build a brand new facility, probably on the west side. It's not necessarily the case, but what we've planned right now in the collection system, it would tell us to build it on the west side near the airport. And we would bond for $220 million in 2022 so that we could have the new facility up and going by 25. Please.
So I can see how they kind of end up in the same place, but that's looking at the combined fund balance. What's the actual cost to the taxpayers? Because we have interest and construction costs. Here you have 220. It seemed like the other one added up to less.
So I'm not gonna answer your question exactly maybe the way you posed it, but let me tell you when I saw the results last week, Jimmy had kind of finalized this with our consultant and done some really good work so that it was easy for me to see and easy for you to see as a council. I spent a little bit of time thinking about it and thought, how do I feel as a department director coming and recommending some of these options? And as an elected official, are you going to feel comfortable about some of these numbers? So some of the numbers that aren't on the pages, let me give them to you. So this option that's up right here, the annual bond payment, based on the assumptions that we've made, 30-year bond, the interest rate, the annual payment is about $11 million every single year for 30 years. And you would be committing, if we follow this option, we would be committing the city to pay $11 million just to the bank, basically, for interest and principal for 30 years. For comparison's sake, right now our total revenue in the wastewater or wastewater total revenue is about $11 million. So we're committing what we make right now in revenue, we're committing that amount just to pay this loan back. And I got a little uncomfortable with that. Option 2, where we have 3 bonds, it's a little bit better. Our maximum bond, because it's varied, there's 3 different bonds that take off in different years, but the maximum bond that we pay under option 2 is I think it's $6.5 million. And that's still, again, half of our current revenue that we make. And I'm not even sure that I'm comfortable asking the council or making a recommendation to the council that that's a good option to pursue. Yesterday, as the staff met on this, we asked a few more questions. And this is where the numbers get really interesting. On option 3, how much interest would the city pay on a $220 million bond over 30 years? Any guesses? $110 million in interest. Based on those interest rates and those assumptions, again, be careful. You know, there's lots of variables there. But trying to get an apples to apples comparison, we've made some base assumptions here. $110 million in interest is a lot of money for interest. We could build a lot of facilities with wastewater.
The problem with that is 2022 interest rates are going to be higher. I don't think
More
it's
likely.
the 2.8. They're going to be higher.
Potentially.
They're going to be higher.
And the concern that I started having again as I thought about this over the weekend, I started looking at those numbers and saying to myself, you know, kind of along those same lines, interest rates probably are going to be higher. What's going to happen financially in the next 30 years? You know, I mean, I hate to say this, but I think reality is you're probably going to see a couple of downturns in the economy, probably two in 30 years, maybe more. And do you really want the city obligated to make $11 million in payments when you might be struggling some fiscal year? Is that really the right thing to do? Some of the other unknowns that we talked about, the regulations, if they're delayed, if they're not delayed by, you know, in this particular case, by 2022, if we still don't know in 2022 what the state is going to do with Utah Lake regulations, and we pull the trigger on this and say we're gonna go ahead and move forward, if they change the regulations and if they loosen them up, particularly if they change the dates on them, we don't get a break from the bank to pay back that loan. That they don't change and say, well, you know, you guys spent $220 million and we're changing the regulations, so you don't really need what you built anymore. But the bonding company doesn't cut us any slack on that bond payment because of variables that we're trying to describe. So the last option that we developed was mostly one that came out of, if you want to describe it, my discomfort with the options that we had come up with so far. And one of the things that I asked Jimmy to look at, and it was mostly being driven from this conversation about how much is the annual payments, because we have to come up with a certain amount of money. If we bond, if we borrow money for that, we have to come up with the money to pay for it anyway. So instead of bonding, is there a way just to come up with the money and make the projects move forward with a pay-as-you-go, so that you don't have to bond for it? And so we're coming up with nearly the same amount annually, not quite, but we're because we're not paying interest on some of those amounts, but we still have some pretty steep increases that we have to look at. So option 4 is a phased new approach and does not include any bonding. And the rate increases, instead of 3% in 21 and 22, we had to adjust to a 3.5% increase from 21 through 29. So that is one change. And then we have 1% increases from 30 to 49. We also set aside, in this particular example, we set aside $1 million for life support on the existing treatment plant. So we're replacing equipment that may wear out. We're doing some things that may be needed at the existing treatment plant, but we're not doing any upgrades, nothing major at the treatment plant. You can see that we keep above fund balance. There is I think 1 or 2 years that we drop about $500,000 below into the negative, but it's pretty darn close, you know, throughout it. But I have to tell you, we don't have a ton of fund balance in any of this. We never, hardly ever get above $5 million, which is less than 25% of your total revenue. You can see, though, we set aside $10 million. I should back up here a tad and explain. I apologize. So what the plan is for phase 4 is we need to generate $60 million by 2026. And that would allow us to build a certain amount of what they call trains in a new facility on the west side. Each train would treat about 6 million gallons per day. And we could build one train in 2029, or excuse me, 2021. 2021, potentially we have one train built. And the reason that this is important is we have the ability, with a train up and running in the new treatment plant, we have the ability to treat that water and discharge it directly to either Provo Bay or to Utah Lake, and not pump it, not lift it to our existing treatment plant. So this process has the potential of eliminating the need for the future parallel 36 that I described to you before. It has the ability, depending on how development happens on the west side, it has the ability to develop enough treatment capacity on the west side to treat directly at a new treatment plant any new development that happens. So the challenge here is we have to figure out how to pay for a new collection system and a phased approach for a new treatment plant to try to keep up with west side development. Or, you know, we need to be careful about what we're doing on the west side so that financially we can pay for both the collection system and a phased in treatment plant. So by again, we raise $60 million by 2026 in this approach. Jimmy, do you have, I don't know if it's in here. I'd like the council to see how we generate this revenue for the treatment plant in the spreadsheet, you know, where you show the 2 million and the 5 million for the next fiscal years. Then after 26, we set aside $10 million every single year in revenue for increases at the treatment plant, all the way out to 2044. And the reason that jumped, I know Kelsey's bringing this other thing up, but the reason that the fund balance jumped dramatically in 44 was because all of a sudden we have revenue capable of generating $10 million a year for a treatment plant, but we no longer need it because we've built a brand new treatment plant. It's basically the interest that we're making, that we're gaining at that point. And so our fund balance in option 4 skyrockets in 44 because we have the capability of generating that kind of revenue, but we're not paying it to the bank in interest.
I applaud this approach. It's something that the council has encouraged as well, sort of pay-as-you-go approach to saving for the future, saving for future needs. Have you found it difficult in that approach to protect that money, to use it as you plan it over 30 years? Do you feel like that you'll be able to do that easily? Do you think there would be challenges, I guess, is what I'm asking, with different administrations and different staff, and how do you maintain that goal and that vision and that this is what we're doing with this money?
There's not a guarantee. I mean, we're talking about more than 25, we're talking 30 years into the future here. Right. And if there's an unknown in the governance of the city and future decisions from a council, from even a department, you know, there's as many unknowns as I've listed in regulations and other unknowns. And I can't guarantee that the city's not going to do something that dramatically changes this approach. But I think it would be key for councils, for the department, for administrations to pass on, you know, this is the master plan for getting a new treatment plant. And if you change the plan significantly, you're going to obligate the city to make a bond that we could have avoided if you stick to the path, if you stick to the goals. And the one component, and I probably failed to communicate clearly to the council, the one benefit that I see in your question is that we can compartmentalize a new treatment plant. So our consultants come back and said, you can build one train, and then you can build another train, and you can build another train, and every train basically just is a mirror image of the one that's next to it. And each of those can treat somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 million gallons per day. And so every time we build another train, we get another 6 million gallons out there. And it's going to cost probably somewhere in the range of, you know, $20 million per train. But if we can generate enough money each time, we can go out and say, let's go build another train. So it's not, you know, it's not just sitting in the bank. So that, you know, once we get that revenue, we say, let's pull the trigger and go and build another train. And we decrease the amount that's going at our treatment plant. The state will allow us, one of the big pluses in this is we are building a treatment plant, and again, I failed to communicate this well to the council. The request that I've made to the consultant is to build a state-of-the-art facility. This is one that's going to eliminate pharmaceuticals. This is any regulation that we see coming in the future. This is a treatment plant that almost certainly would be able to eliminate anything that we would see coming right now. They call it a membrane plant. What's the full name of it, Shane or Rebecca?
Membrane bioreactor.
So it's it is the state of the art. This is a treatment plant that can meet phase 2 regulations in phosphorus. The day that it goes into operation, we're already meeting the second stage. And the reason that the state likes that is they allow us to look at the average between 2 treatment plants. They say if you're already at a new treatment plant treating 6 million gallons a day and the phosphorus is already at a 0.1 or lower than that, and your current treatment plant is at a 2 or a 3 right now, they're going to look at the total effluent between those and average those 2 things out. And so they're going to say, on an average, are you discharging 1 milligram per liter between those 2 treatment plants? And we'll meet the regulations by averaging the 2 treatment plants together.
This is maybe a naive question too, because I'm not sure about land area or what we own, but is there a way that when you take out trickling ponds and some other things, is there a way to build on site this new plant and not affect I mean, how much does that affect the price to do that on site as opposed to a new location?
It probably does not change the overall price for a new treatment plant, whether we build it on the west side out by the airport or whether we do this option, and we could exercise this option at the existing treatment plant. We would build it adjacent to the existing treatment plant. There's some facilities that, particularly to the east of the treatment plant, that we no longer use. And we could potentially demolish all of those existing facilities and build this right next to it. One of the things that we're still having conversations about internally and with consultants is the whole reuse question. So one of the things that I explained to the administration is, if we're getting to the point, if we're building this state-of-the-art facility that we're talking about, we're getting really, really close to drinking water standards. And we're basically mimicking what we see in California and Arizona with this treatment plant. And what you see in Arizona and California is reuse. And I'm not talking about secondary water reuse, I'm talking about drinking water reuse. And it's not the best, it's not a pleasant subject to talk about in Utah. It's not happening very much. But again, we tend to be a little bit behind in this conversation. And it is happening in California and Arizona. And by the time you look out at 2049, it may be an issue, and maybe sooner than that, it may be an issue that Utah is facing. And the conversation about the effluent that is drinking water ready, whether it's an injection into the aquifer and it's pulled back out someplace else, or whether it's direct reuse, it's a conversation that I think you have to be prepared to address. And this process, this plant, is one that would be ready to have that conversation. And if you talk about ejection of the effluent into an aquifer, out by Utah Lake may not be the best place. The existing treatment plant is probably a better place because it's closer to the foothills. And I told Wayne the other day, if you really want the best place for injection and the conversation that Provo ought to have as far as groundwater injection, it's in the northeast corner of the city. And that's where we've had plenty of studies that indicate that's where our water from our drinking wells come from. It comes from the mouth of the canyon and basically travels to the southwest through the city. And if you want to put water into the aquifer in a strategic location, that's the place. It doesn't prohibit building the treatment plant out on the west side. You can always put a pipeline and pump it back to the northeast corner of the city and do the injection there. And there may be agencies at some point that are willing to pay for that cost because drinking water is going to become necessary. Not that it's not necessary now, it's going to become more necessary. It's going to become more rare.
Let me see if I understand the numbers. We're either saying we're going to obligate future councils to $11 million payments or a 3.5% increase. And the $11 million payments don't go away, 3.5 increase depending on what happens to regulations, it might go up or down. Is that what we're saying?
It is. This
is the most flexible approach by far.
By far, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to do the $11 million, what's happening in Montgomery, Alabama, or Puerto Rico. I mean, you can look at places that have those bonds that they can't pay, just devastated.
And I think the reason I hesitated on your question it is a 3.5 on option 4. It's a 3.5% increase, but the other options still have increases. I can't remember the exact numbers.
2.7.
Yeah.
So
So you still got increases.
Sounds to me like you might be able to tweak it a little bit though, in the mid-20s to make sure you have a fund balance.
Keep above that. And I think it's important to understand these assumptions, again, we're trying to make an apples to apples comparison. None of them have any cost of construction increases. You know, there's no inflation. So each year the council would have to look at this. Ideally, they would have to look at it and say, okay, we have to have a 3.5% increase, but we've also got a 1% or a 2% cost of construction increase, and we have to adjust for that as well. So we're looking at this comparison in today's dollars, and it's important for the council to understand this. So these increases may turn into 5%, you know, fairly easy. But I would make that recommendation under all 4 options. That same consideration is valid under all 4 options. Please.
Okay, so I am concerned about construction costs, and if you look back the last 5, 10 years, how much has it been going up? And normally I don't like bonding, although in the history of bonds, the rates have never ever been lower, incredibly low. So is it $20 million to do one phase?
26 million.
Yeah.
Or excuse me. We raised 60 million by 2026. So we can do one train, and it's probably in 21 or 22. We're hoping to raise enough money. And I'm going to vary just a tad from your question. So this amount, there's one fiscal year. In fact, there's 2 fiscal years that aren't shown right here. You can see Jimmy's got the total number that we have to set aside every single year. And the reason that we start small is because we have been behind on rates. And so that we're not financially ready to be able to say, today we can do $10 million. We can't do that. So the increases of 19 and 15% that we talk about, it starts to get us in a position where we can set aside $10 million a year. And so we start with 2 million, 5 and 5, and hopefully sometime in this year, we have enough set aside that we could build one train or part of one train and start treating, even if it was only 3 MGD, half the train, which the consultant is telling us that we could do, we would have a facility up and going somewhere in the time frame of 2021.
So what's the shortest term bond you can take typically?
John probably is better.
Well, one of the things that you run into when you're issuing bonds is just the issuance costs and what it takes to do. I mean, you can do shorter, but I would say in a normal environment, probably 10 years is what the shortest you would see.
I just thought I'd throw that out there, trying to balance the reality of.
to do one early bond essentially and combine a couple of these options.
Right.
Please.
So we talked about the Magi. Have we looked at how these options affect that? I mean, it seems to me after the 17 and 19% increases, we're probably about at that line. I'm guessing that under this, we're.
Okay, so you took us right to I think this is the last slide in the presentation. So this is a comparison of the 4 options, and every 10 years we give you what a typical residential, the average residential bill is going to look like. And obviously they all start pretty close to the same, but they start to separate in 30. Option 4 is actually the most expensive. They start to come back a little bit more in line in 40. And by 49, this one's looking a lot better. And it's actually, this one is in 44, where the rate increases can stop, basically. Because if you look at if you look at the fund balance, I mean, you've almost got $50 million in fund balance by the time, because you've got 6 years where you have the capability of setting aside $10 million in your fund, but you don't need it anymore.
Forgive me if I missed this earlier, but so if you go with option 4 and 2021, 22 for construction and completion of the extra capacity necessary, what happens to the 600 services on the west side that we think we have available now? Do we give them all out at once? Do we prorate it over the next 5 years? What would be the plan for development?
So this is the detail that the staff, we need to spend some more time, and this is probably the next presentation that we need to come back, both to Planning Commission, to the council, maybe even to the West Side Planning Group, so that they understand here's capacity that we could generate in the next 5 years in our CIP. And it may be part of one of those trains being constructed, it may be 2 trains. And what does that give us from a development unit standpoint, that we could say by 2021, we can have X number of units approved on the west side, or we could have them built, because you can approve them, and as long as your facility's under construction too, it's with the houses, and they're not generating any waste, you know, you can, as long as they come online pretty close together, you're okay.
I just think it's a critically important factor for us to know.
It is.
There may be some other options as well that the staff's talking about now in terms of trying to divert some existing flow out of the west side so that it doesn't all come through the 36-inch line. So there's some other things we're looking at that might add into this equation of trying to figure out the development capacity on the west side.
I'll give you a little bit more detail on what Wayne talked about, because I think it's important to know that the staff is spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to divert or how to keep some of our flow that currently goes from the east side of the city to the west side and then back to the east side to our treatment plant. And there's some that does that. In fact, there's a pretty good portion of the city that does that. And Rebecca found in the modeling effort, she found one place on 500 North where we could divert some of the flow where it starts going west. At that point, we could actually divert it back into a manhole. It's not very far away. I think it's less than 200 feet away from another manhole. And it seems to have the capacity downstream from that point where we could divert 1 or 2 CFS that currently goes to the west side and keep it on the east side of the city. This is a really good way, a fairly inexpensive way to add capacity to the existing 36. We're keeping some of the flow from ever getting to the 36 in the first place. And it's going to add more units. We're not to the point of saying to the council, hey, this absolutely can work. We've got survey people going out and looking at it to make sure that it's going to work from a gravity standpoint. It's one of those details that we're not quite ready to say, yes, this is an absolute. But if it pans out, this is going to add more units available on the west side.
Certainly could help fill that gap between now and 2020.
I just know there's a lot of pressure, and I think having a plan for it would be helpful to know.
So when would the existing plant, assuming we do build on the west side, finally be phased out, shut down?
So the entire amount of money is not under option 4. It doesn't end up being spent until 2044. That's the end of the spending. So you'd go out and build train by train in the new treatment plant, but the end of the spending would be somewhere around 44. And your existing treatment plant, our existing treatment plant, would likely have to stay in operation until probably 40 at least.
Okay, so the reason I ask that is it produces a certain amount of effluent, which goes through the golf course. It saves the golf course a lot of money each year on watering. So eventually, if they're not getting that water from the golf course at that location, they're going to have to buy or pay for the water that they used to get for free.
So you're right. One of the issues, I guess, that I would point out, and this is not probably a direct answer to your question, because they probably would need a source for irrigation. But one of the components, one of the unknowns that I didn't spend a lot of time on in here goes back to stormwater. And the mill race, where our effluent is dumped right now, the mill race is the one that goes down into the golf course. The mill race is also a large outfall for stormwater. A significant amount of our stormwater goes through that same mill race. And one of the concerns that we have is the state is eventually going to step in, and we'll see the same regulations that we see in other states. And they'll say, not just your effluent from your wastewater, but your stormwater has to be treated also for pollutants, for nutrient removals. And it's part of the reason that we're considering potentially doing an engineered wetland for our effluent on our treatment plant. That treatment plant may disappear in 40, but that mill race will likely still be used for stormwater outfalls. And that engineered wetland would continue to be a benefit for the city. It's not money wasted, but it doesn't benefit the effluent anymore. It benefits your stormwater instead. So it's taking, hopefully it's taking your stormwater down into the range of 1 milligram per liter. I hope they never go below that. I'm not going to guarantee that though. But an engineered wetland would likely not take it below, based on what we know right now, it's probably not going to take your stormwater below 1 milligram.
I guess the bottom line is there may be a continued use for the existing wastewater treatment plant, may just be processing stormwater. And if that's the case, then we're continuing to at least provide some water capacity for the golf course.
And if that's the case, if the state does, because there are, there's articles, I can find them fairly easily. Regulations in Europe are on stormwater. They are pretty easy to find, and they're regulating stormwater and they're treating it. They're taking it into a treatment plant that, you can imagine in Utah, it would sit unused for 99% of the time. We get rain so rare in Utah that it would sit unused for long periods of time, and then all of a sudden you're going to have to treat a whole bunch of water in a big hurry.
So you just mentioned that the old plant may change uses and treat stormwater.
Could at some point.
So if we didn't move the plant to the west side and try to just upgrade and stay at the same location, then eventually we would all have another problem where we have to deal with all this stormwater at that same plant.
If the state, and this is a big unknown, if the state went to the point of forcing cities to treat stormwater, that's a valid concern. But you got to realize in these options, we don't have anything to keep that treatment plant up and going. So if they turned around and said in 44 or 50, oh, by the way, you're going to have to start treating stormwater, we'd probably have major concerns of the condition of the treatment plant at that point.
That's where you take all that profit and spend it.
Maybe.
How dare you say that?
I wish I knew enough to be able to say that's what's going to happen, but obviously I don't.
I just have a question. The table that had the cost comparison for the 4 plans, why isn't the plan 1 far more expensive than plan 4? If you're factoring in $140 million of interest on the bonds, and I don't know, is that not factored in?
Well,
You're saving all that money in bond of interest on the bond, but it's not in those cost comparisons. That what I guess I don't understand the table. So in fiscal year
Option
49,
three.
you have 276,550, or I'm sorry, 276,550,000 for option 1, and that's the bonding option, correct? And you said you're paying $140 million on that bond, on those bonds, those 3 bonds or whatever.
Interest.
Interest, right? The interest on the bonds. But then the option 4 would have no interest because you're not bonding, but there's only, only $32 million of difference between the two. So I don't know.
So you would be spending, in option 4, you're spending a lot less. Both options are at the existing treatment plant. Sorry.
One has no interest and the other does.
And you said it was $140 million of interest. So that's where I'm confused about the numbers.
Yeah, this is the interest in option 1. It's only about 1.3 per year in those, once all the bonds have been
received. So there's a lot more investment going in to the existing plant than when we're phasing to a new plant and just letting it kind of life support.
So it's more like 35 to 40 million.
Well, option 3 was your biggest,
Yeah, option 3 was 100.
was the biggest bump.
Oh, option 3 was, but it was still not that much more than 4, right?
But it continued, you know, those.
It was very comparable. So I guess, I don't
That
know.
it doesn't even capture all of the bond repayment to that point. Still a few more years left. You know, so we've gone up to 49, but in a sense, you know, with some of these options where we've got bonds,
Still have bonds out.
yeah,
Right,
we're not even to the end of the
Still
month.
paying off 49.
Yeah, like when there's the 3 bonds, that third
Yeah.
bond will
Could be
extend another
28.
20 more years beyond.
And locking our rates to a point where they're paying that consistent bond payment, but
So the
The
interest
payment's
is
higher.
included in that, right?
Yes.
In that amount.
But some of the bonds do carry. I think that's the concern, and we could carry this out to the end of the bond life, but in option 2, where one of the bonds is in 29, you've got to carry it to 59 to see the interest.
Mhm. So in reality, those are much more, they're going to cost way more than option 4. Not just what's pictured there.
So you're saying that.
so yeah, this is just.
By the year.
Yeah, so by the time you're done paying off all those bonds, you're paying way more
So this-
for option
yeah,
1
this-
and
we're
2
doing-
and 3,
this goes-
way more for 4.
We're doing 200, in option 3 by 49, we're doing 246 million in projects, but it does not factor in. like you
Does
said,
not include your
it does not include
interest.
the 100. The rates factor in paying that, so that's where you're getting to the $105 per month.
But the above prices.
But this amount does not include interest.
Yeah, okay.
It's just
That makes sense.
investment.
This is project costs.
So that would be added on to it then.
So if you wanted us to modify, when we come back with more detail, we could show this as total costs, including interest, and, you know, maybe that's a fair
But isn't that
comparison.
going to raise the rates? I mean, the monthly, average monthly
no.
rate, that's,
The rates are already factoring in.
it's already factored in because it's
It's already got the
percentage,
rates.
so
Yes.
they factored in, you factored in the interest for the
I factored in the
rates
interest and then set the rates at a point where we would keep the fund balance above.
above 0.
And you might have to go beyond fiscal year 49 to show the total cost because of the, whatever the length of the bond is.
Yes. I think it's important, again, kind of circling back and saying, what are the takeaways, you know, from the presentation? We're trying to tell the council that we are running up against some tight constraints on the existing system. We're trying to do a couple of things that allow us, not just with a treatment plant, but, you know, modifications to the existing system that allow us to allow development to move forward. So I don't want one of the takeaways to be, hey, we're going to stop development on the west side because of sewer. We're not there. We need to get some more information and come back with more detail, you know, particularly a 5-year CIP, so that the council understands exactly what the challenges are, how we pay for this, and can we allow development to continue forward on the west side, and what needs to happen concurrently with development happening on the west side relative to wastewater. I also, I want to make sure that the council understands the potential path that we're going down if we pass the resolution on the 14th. And these are big numbers, you know, these are significant numbers. One of the options that we didn't spend very much time on, and I want to make sure that the council understands on the 14th, we do have the option to go to the existing treatment plant, and we can put a chemical treatment into our existing plant. It would probably cost somewhere between $20 and $30 million just for the the chemical capital cost. It would also increase chemical use by $1 million. It would change our operations significantly at the treatment plant. It would cost some additional money there, and it would not set us up to meet the second step of the regulations in 2030. But we do have that option to go, and it would likely spend, you know, as far as facilities and other upgrades associated with it, we would probably be somewhere in the neighborhood the Timpanogos Special Improvement District did to meet their first steps. Probably in the 60, 80, maybe a tad higher
range just to do the bare minimum. But it doesn't set us up for the 2030 regulations that we feel like are coming. And part of the reason that we tend to favor one of the other options is it's the second step that we're looking at. It's not the first step that we're concerned about. It's what's happening in the future. And our feeling is that, certainly my feeling at least, is that it eventually will hit the state and we will be asked to meet the regulations based on what we're seeing in other states around the West, particularly.
We have confidence that the ground on the west side will support the weight of a facility like we're going to build.
We have the ability to engineer it. It would definitely require some modification. You know, you saw what they did on the West Side Connector when they built that. They had to put a lot of weight on it to get it to basically sink. And we would have to protect it from the lake. We would have to dike around a new treatment plant so that would keep the lake from you know, coming up and impacting the treatment plant. And I think another one that I think the council needs to be clear on, another concept, we have not said absolutely go and build a treatment plant on the west side. There's still, you know, the whole conversation about the reuse question. That's still one that's a little bit up in the air. The site by the airport, it's a good site. There's probably some pluses. There's probably some negatives to it though also. And we aren't to the point of saying that's absolutely where it's going to go.
Would you have to pile up dirt for a certain amount of time and
yes,
play the game?
Yep. And that's the conversation we're having with Horrocks engineers. Even on the pipeline right now, we're talking about a pipeline that's 20 to 25 feet in the ground. And they're saying, you want to get some weight on that ground and just, you know, long rows of dirt basically where the pipeline's going to go so that you can start to push that down so that you don't have varying settlements once your pipe is in the ground, because you're going to change that ground significantly going 20 feet into the ground.
Just kind of grabbing the scope of this, since the inflation isn't involved or whatever, we're talking going from our current bill to what we're expecting out at 2049. That's an increase of $50. Now that will be actually more because of inflation, but $50 more, $50 per month times 12 months is $600. You compare $600 to the average property tax bill of our residents. It's big. It's big, and that property tax bill is for all of the services, not just the city portion. The city portion, I mean, that dwarfs the city portion of that. So just trying to.
But just think what the property tax will be then too.
Yeah, well, perhaps we'll keep up with inflation if we'll make inflation adjustments, but otherwise it won't. But the other thought is we're talking about reuse, and I'm glad we're looking at that and looking at in the future, whatever. But boy, I sure would rather reuse that water on agricultural land than using it for tap water. But that's just me.
I think the only challenge to that is we've tried to forecast in looking at current growth projections. Water is the limiting factor. Drinking water is the limiting factor. And so the value of that reusable water 25 years from now will be dramatically different than it is today. And so again, you could certainly apply it agriculturally, but there may be a point of argument that you ought to be selling it to Central Utah Water to be deployed in Salt Lake County or other places where the growth is. And all of a sudden that water is worth its weight in gold.
How about a bottled water plant?
Don't even get me started. Been there, done that.
I think that's a good point. Maybe that helps pay for some of the later stuff as well.
It's actually one of the primary things that we're considering.
Trying to figure out the market, yeah.
So do all four of those options require the variance letter, or is there any of them that wouldn't need it?
All four options require it. The only option, and it's not listed, the only option that would not require it is the one that I just described to the council and going to the chemical treatment at our existing facility.
Do you need a motion from us?
I don't think so. I think we just want you to know going into the 14th, what the path is. Gary?
Just a comment to council. This variance letter, the majority of the treatment plants that come down the Wasatch Front are going through the same inspections that we are as far as trying to meet these future regulations. And so Provo is not unique in this at all. Salt Lake City, I think, we've heard around $300 million is what they're blocking for as far as their signing. There's a lot of this very discussion happening. And so I just wanted you to be aware, we are not unique in the challenges that we're facing.
I imagine Karen's listening, Ms. Tapahe's listening. I would love, to me, and we're talking about the 14th, and yes, it's just for the variance on the 14th, but we're talking about some significant numbers. I'd love to see some good information that's digestible by the public, put on our open city hall, or, I mean, just some way that we can get this, let our residents be aware of the type of numbers that we're looking at.
Happy to work with the council staff and try to get some information that's easy to look at.
Sounds good. We'll probably move on in the interest of time, Mr. Strickland.
Yes, I think all of these, moving on to the next item, but
That's fine.
I think these discussions we've had have been really good today, and Karen wants you to know she's listening. We promised council meetings from 9 to 1. We're at 1. Talked to Matt, 5 to 15 minutes probably isn't even enough to start getting into it. So we're proposing just to come back at the work session on the 14th of November and carry on from there with the parking strategic plan.
Before we finish this item, I guess we'll finish up, but it's a significant amount of money. It might be worth having the committee take a look and if that would be interesting. But
Sure. All right, is there anything else? Thank you very much. If there's no objection, we'll declare the meeting adjourned by unanimous consent.